ברכי נפשי es Hashem. Today we're about to study page 85, Tractate Shabbat. Just a word of Torah before it begins. You know that we have just finished a book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, and we are now at the very beginning of a new chapter in the Jewish history, the book of Shmot. The Torah called this book of Shmot, but the first letter on the parasha is Vav Ve'ele. Ve'ele meaning it's connected to the previous one. So for sure there is a famous Ramban that said, he called this book Sefer HaGeula, the book of redemption. However, Rav Hai Gaon, which is one of the greatest rabbi of the Gaonic era of the 7th century, he called this book HaSefer HaSheni, the second book. How come he called this book in that name, the second book? The Netziv, the great rabbi of Volozhin, explains that this book, the book of Exodus, the book of Shmot, it's very much connected to the whole story of creation and the beginning and the whole story of the Jewish past, the Jewish history. Because we are so rooted to our tradition, to our sources, to the original story of the Jewish people, you cannot uproot the story of Exodus as a separate entity. HaSefer HaSheni meaning chapter 2, but it's connected very much to chapter 1. Ve'ele, one connected to the other. It means in our current life that we are rooted in our Torah, in our tradition, and the whole story which we studied yesterday. The Mishna said, a famous text from the book of Yeshayahu, that said, Ki ka'aretz totzi tzimcha vechegana zeru'ea tatzmiach. Isaiah promised the same way as the land go through a certain process. If you planted a seed in the ground, it's go through a process of decay for a certain time, and then later that beautiful vegetation come out as either flower or tree or other beautiful thing, but it goes through a process of decay, looks like it disappear. That's the nation of Israel. They go through Egypt, go through a very hard time. Looks like there's no hope. You look nowadays, there's so much anti-Semitism and so much anti-Jewish sentiment and anti-Israel sentiment. And we have to remember, Ve'ele Shmot, we went through that in the past. We went through exile in Egypt, and it's all connected. We cannot uproot it ourselves from the past. With that in mind, we're about to begin our subject, which is the page today is the page that discusses the Hilchot Kilayim. Kilayim is a Torah prohibition of mixture of two different vegetations, which means we planted the seed in the ground, but if there are different entities in those seeds, we cannot mix them, and we need to understand the difference between mixing them while you're planting it or mixing them while they are growing. And we're going to elaborate on different size, different measurement, and hopefully, if times allow, we go further with connection to Hilchot Shabbat. So I'd like to ask you to pay attention to this beautiful graph that Rashi provided. And Rashi brought, if you look at the GEMARA, and I'm sure that all the people who view us also have somehow a form of GEMARA. So you can see in that GEMARA the part of the Rashi, which is the very basic, simple example of Aruga. Because the top of the page 85, they said, is just completion of the previous thought. Vekimlu lerabanan dechamsha beshita layankei bahadade. The sages have in the accepted tradition that 5 seeds in a 6 tfachim, 6 handbreadth space, do not draw sustenance from one another. Meaning, when a person planting the seeds, he needs to put a space between them. Why? because the Torah forbids us to mix those vegetables. Now, there is a very different core of differentiation between the idea of planting or growing. Underground, if you are speaking about watering the seed, or you are speaking about the way that they have the yenika, the way that they get their basic sustenance, it makes no difference if there are different type of seeds. In other words, we have no halachic problem to have a mixture of different seeds in a sense of having the same source of life, such as water or other thing. Our issue is only when it's coming out and grow, we need to have a distance of 6 handbreadth between each entity. And if you look at the Rashi, you see this example. You need to see a difference between them in order to make sure that the person recognizes the difference. If you remember, in our last talk we mentioned others because there are at least 5 opinions when it's come to this. Take for example the opinion of Meiri. Meiri is the great rabbi of a little after the time of Rashi, and the Meiri hold that the way that you planted is in such a different type of growth of vegetation that every person recognizes that there are differences. In other words, as long as you go in the 5 different area, which is the 4 different corner of that field, of that aruga. Remember this word, I'm going to use it a lot, aruga, meaning the field that you planted. So in that space, in that aruga, you have 4 different spots, because the corner you always leave for the poor, so you put it in a 4 different spots, and you have a center one, the middle, the center one. And as long as Rabbeinu Hananel and Meiri said that you recognize the different one, and as long as you have a 6 handbreadth space between each of them, you can go ahead and plant in your field a different plant of seed, even they're using the same source of living, such as the materials that you plant underground for them, or the water that you water all of them. The Rosh hold a little different. The Rosh hold that the centerpiece is not square, is a round centerpiece, and he hold that each one of those 5 has to have, and soon you talk about siman heker, that you recognize. For example, you have lines in one of them. You have a different style of planting, so it's not just different seeds, and it's not just the distance between them, but also the way that it appear by a stranger who recognize this one is square, this one is round, this one is a line, this is not, etc. That's, by the way, the very similar to the Shitat Geonim, the Geonic opinion. Rambam hold that it's not just that. Rambam hold that the centerpiece can come even closer as long as is one spot of the centerpiece have the 6 handbreadth, not the entire part, but as long as one square had it. The Tiferet Israel, the famous interpretation of the Mishnah, he hold, and soon we're going to study it, it's called Rosh HaTor, which means it looks like a pyramid, like a triangle, and in that sense the spot is just the lines between each of the arugot. With that in mind, let's go to page 85, top of the page. Umenalan dehakim lo urabanan miltahi. From where do we derive that the sages have accepted the tradition in such a way now, which means 5 by 6, which means how do the sages have the source that the measure of Yanika, the foundation of the living of all those plants, is such and such. The sages, you may ask, Rashi said, that there are people who sitting and study, and they are not, farmers. And since it's not halacha le Moshe miSinai, something that Moses received from Sinai, the question is, since the sages have the knowledge of the nature, and the Ritva elaborate, and he said that since they have this foundation of the Torah and knowledge of the nation, how they come to a specification of 5 by 6. Clear? The Khatam Sofer has a beautiful writing. In general, there is a school of thought that said that they have this type of, Kabbalistic traditions. But if you go in a simple way, the Ritva said, just by not being a agricultural people, a farmer, and it's not halacha le Moshe Mishnah, it is not a tradition that transmitted from Moses, how they come to this definition of minimum requirement of distance between each one of those small arugot has to be 5 by 6. The GEMARA respond, and they said, the Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mai dechtiv lo tasig gvul re'acha asher gavlu rishonim. The Torah speaks about Isur Hasagat Gvul, meaning you have Mr. Reuven and you have Mr. Shimon, and they have two properties that one line of both properties attached to each other. Now Reuven come at night, and guess what he do? He taking the border line and move it couple of meter within the property of Shimon. Okay? So it not necessarily means that he physically takes a borderline or fence and go at night and move the fence in a distance toward Shimon properties. That's not necessarily the case. What is the case of Hasagat Gvul is for sure in a simple way. Rashi said in the Deuteronomy 19 that in a simple way is just physically moving the fence. But we go further to say Hasagat Gvul can go to another stage, which is if you have a tree, you're planting a tree, and over the time, guess what? Shimon also have something in that border. And the root of the trees, guess what they are doing? Over the time, those seeds, those roots, they go toward your neighbors, those Shimon property. Now, when Shimon putting a water or whatever materials to fertilize his field, you, meaning Reuben, since you tree, the roots of your tree, it goes further on toward Shimon's properties, you basically mesig gvul, you move the border of your property toward his property, because your tree has the source of living from Shimon's property. That's called Hasagat Gvul. As a side note, you should know that there's a lot of halachic derivative from that, such as, it's a big question if you have a business and somebody else come and open across the street another business. Is that and he is taking some of your customers. Is that considering Hasagat Gvul? It's a big discussion. In general, the GEMARA in Bava Metzia said that it's not. That the person can open, for example, the same type of, let's say, Chinese restaurant next door or across the street, and it's not considering Hasagat Gvul. But yes, there are certain situations that it is Hasagat Gvul. For example, if you are IT person and you have clientures, and somebody else come in and he basically one of your students, and you teach him IT, and tomorrow morning he open a company, and guess what he's doing? He's taking all the contact list of your customers, and he shipped them. He said, I offer you less money, I offer you the same service or better or worse. But the point is, he has the contact list and he has the knowledge that you taught him, and he is masik vul, he is moving the border, because you taught him in order to either you employee or to open it in a different states or new customers. And he instead, what he's doing, is moving the border toward your property. So that's called asagat gvul. So what we derive from that, the GEMARA said, gvul shegavlu rishonim lo tasig, which means that the border you have between you and your neighbor, between Reuven and Shimon, do not, the Torah said, do not plant a seed, anything, close to the borderline. Why? Because you basically denigrating the value of your neighbor's property, and you are basically removing the border of the fence between the two properties. And how? The Torah used the term Asher Gavlu Rishonim, the border that the early generations set, which means that there is a certain line, and therefore now we understand how the sages come to the whole dinim, all the halakhot of Kilayim, of the law of the mixture, and the idea of 5 by 6 handbreadth, because that's the minimum requirement of borderlines between two neighbors. Clear? Is that clear? So, with that in mind, you see that this is not a simple halachot, because it can involve in a lot of lawsuits between two people. You know, people always say that the Talmudists, the rabbis who study Talmud, are top lawyers. You hear it all the time. Now you see where they get it, right? It's all the beauty of Torah. So anyway, my gavlu rishonim. What does that mean? The border that the early generation set by. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yonatan. My dechtiv, what does that mean when the Torah said in Bereshit, in Genesis chapter 36, Eile bnei seir hachori yoshvei haaretz. These are the sons of Seir the Chori, who inhabited the land. And the Torah gives a list. They said Lotan and Shoval and Zibon and Ana, etc. So the question is, Atu kule alma yoshvei rakia ninu? So you're going to tell me that since they use the term of yoshvei haaretz, the inhabit of the land, everyone else living in where? In the heavens. What's the idea of that they're living in the land? So as a side note, the Maharsha said that it's called a Eretz Mesuyemet, a specific land, which is the Olam Tachton, the earthly world, and the heavenly world. But the reason that we call them in such a name, Shehayu Beki'in Bishuva Shel Eretz. It means that they were expert in the settlement of the land. How? Shehayu Omrim, that they will say, Melo Kaneze, that this size of the measurement of the ground, that's what she said, is so and so, this rod, lezait, this rod, it's a feet for an olive tree. Melo kaneze ligfanim, and this full of length of rod is fit for grapes. Umelo kaneze litenim, and this full length of the rod is fit for figs. Kanez so vechori, so we call them Bnei Seir HaChori. We call them the member of the tribe that's called Chori, Choriai. Shemerichim et haaretz. Lehariach in Hebrew meaning to smell. that they smelled herichu the earth, which means they know, like the dog has a certain smell sense, they have this type of sense to know where in the property can be grown there, in that location. Chivi, as you know, one of the name of the nation, it's in the Tosfot said in Chivi that it's one of those, the 7 nations we have, it's called Chivi. So that Chivi gets that name. Why? אמר רב פאפא שהיו תואמים את הארץ כחיוויה. Chivya is name of scorpion, of snake. So since the snake, what did Hashem curse the snake? That he is going to eat the dust from the ground, which means the snake, since Hashem cut off his legs, so he is smell and live on the ground. He smell the ground, he live by the ground. So they call that nation Chivi, like Chivia in Aramaic Hebrew, which means that they are like, the nation are like a snake, which means they are able to, since the snake ate the food on the ground, right? They knew exactly which location you should plant your seed, which means they go around certain fields, certain alugot, and they have that sense to know that in this location you should plant the lemon, and this location you should plant cucumbers, right? So they know to the smell and the taste of each area of the ground. And what a person can know that? Only a snake can have the sense of smell and touch. Only that nation. So because they are so familiar, also Rashi said, with shi'ur yanika, with knowing how much water this ground needed. As you know, there are different ground. There are hard ground, there are soft ground, there are different categories. There are hills, there are valleys. So they knew which ground needs a certain amount of water, and therefore that is, it means the pasuk that used the word rishonim, meaning the early generation. Another interpretation for that name Chori, Rav Acha bar Yaakov amar Chori shena'asu bnei chorin menichsehen. No, it's a different meaning. The reason or the using of the word Chori, because they became free of their possessions. Why? Because as you know, the Esav, the Torah said that he was a mass murderer, and he was in a very strong way, bloody way, gets his way. So one of the things the children of Esau did, they drove them from the land. So it means Chori, that they are free from their possessions. That it means, right? And they don't need to work anymore. So how you go? Because you juxtapose the literal words of Chori and Chorin. Chorin meaning free of. Ben Chorin, free of something. Now, after the GEMARA explained to us the source of the Mishnah, so now we go to the specific, explaining to us how and which part of the aruga of that field go by 6 and 6 of a handbreadth. Amar Rav Asi, or Rashi said Rav Ashi, aruga tocha shisha chutz migvulea. When you take aruga, which is a garden bed, so it has to be internal area 6 by 6 handbreadth, excluding what? The area of its boundaries. Which means if the boundaries around each of the garden bed is the size of tefach, a handbreadth, it has to be included the 6 by 6, Rashi said. And also the central part, Rashi said, it has to have at least 2 handbreadths. So again, remember the rules. We are not speaking about yenika, of underground, the source of living. We are speaking about above ground, that has to have a distance, in that sense, of 2 tfachim, of 2 handbreadths. But in general, what the Mishnah said, Rav Asi or Rav Ashi said, so if you have in 4 corners, you see the picture in the GEMARA, in all different Gemarot, 4 corners of arugot, of garden bed, you can put at the center part a fifth of the garden bed, as long as you have the distance 6 by 6, not including those border lines. Next, Tanya Nameachi. We learn also in another Braita, Aruga Tocha Shisha, which means the internal part of the garden bed has to be, what's the size? 6 handbreadth. So it has to be 6 by 6 handbreadth. Gvulea Bechama. Now we want to clarify the size of the boundaries. Since you have now in your field 5 different plants, so what exactly the size of the boundary itself? Because later we explain the Rosh Tor. Rosh Tor meaning making certain one in a clear way that it looks like a pyramid, looks like different. So if one of them, you know what happened with fields? Over the time when you're planting something, it's extending and going further. And guess what happened when they go further? It's go and cross the border lines between each of the garden bed and hit the other party, correct? And now you have the issue of Klayim. So if you make it looks like a Rosh Tor, so soon we discuss like a pyramid this way, so the top part can go further and hit the border lines and hit the next one, okay? So the Tosfot here and the Ritva has a different approach than Rashi. We do not have the time. I encourage you to read. It's a fascinating Ritva, it's a beautiful Tosfot, but anyway, they said the border has to be as follows. This is a Mishnah in Tractate Kilayim, chapter 3. Kedetnan Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rochav Kimlo Rochav Parsa, which means the size has to be the size of the feet, which is 1 tefach, 1 handbreadth, and that's the side Kimlo, which is, that was a measurement. The Rabbi Novanim and Bartanua explained that in that Tractate Kilayim, in that Mishnah, that was the current well-known measurement. It's called Kimlo Rochav Parsa, in the size of the handbreadth. Amar Rav Papa ve'itema, or Rabbi Chanina bar Papa, my tama de Rabbi Yehuda. What's the reason of this, for the statement of Rabbi Yehuda? He said, Dichtiv, it's written in the book of Dvarim, Deuteronomy 11, V'ishkita beraglecha kegan hayarak, that you water with your foot like a garden of herbs. Meaning, this pasuk, this line in the Torah speaks about Shevach Eretz Yisrael, the beauty of the land of Israel. So one of the things they said, they tried to compare the land of Israel to the land of Egypt in the Torah. So the sentence said that one of the blessings that the land of Israel are granted is they have water that comes from heaven without any effort. Meaning the rabbis tells us that as long as we serving God properly, keeping the Torah and mitzvot, then the abundance of goodness come without an effort from Hashem, from heaven, like a rain. That's the land of Israel. Versus the land of Egypt, they said that you need to use this watering system. Gan hayarak. Gan hayarak is like a garden that the raining water is not sufficient to feed all their needs, and they need to have a special water plan in order to feed all the vegetations that grow. So the Torah said clearly that that's the difference. V'ishkita beraglecha, and you water it with your foot like a garden of herbs, which means no effort involved here. So why? Because the word foot looks like superfluous, but since they use this term, so want to tell us ma regel tefach, the same way that one's foot is what? About of handbreadth wide, av gvul name tefach. So too the boundaries between garden beds where one walks to water plants has to be what? Tefach, 1 handbreadth, the same as the foot itself. Amarav aruga bechurba shaninu. Rav said that when we're speaking about this garden bed, so if you look at the pictures that Rashi provided, soon he provided several pictures, so look at the Rashi's one, and you see that there are 6 here, right? So imagine that you're speaking about a person that goes in the bottom part of the garden bed, and he planted in between that a borderline. So he said, Aruga bechurba shaninu. Our Mishnah speaking in this type of garden bed that does not have anything around that is no other garden bed around, which means that if you have a garden bed that it's among others, so you cannot plant 5 different type of plants, because you cannot distance them each other in the proper distance. Why? Because if you distance them only 3 handbreadth, so it turns that the real distance between them ends up by having less than 2, around 2. So they having only 2 between them, it's a problem. Why? Because we required how many? 3 when you planted this type of field. So now they ask, Ve'a'ika mekom kranot, but you have this kranot, this zaviyot, this desolated area, because anytime you're planting a seed, let's face it, there is a certain area that it grows beautifully, another area you need to constantly change and replant and water more, right? And it's the wind, the effect of the wind that involved, and this one north and this one south. So one garden bed between others, it's hard to plant in a way that they'll not mix with each other. Tosfot said, he disagreed here with Rashi, because Rashi said that the space in between each one of the garden bed provided 2 handbreadths in between them, and he can do something by planting in such a way. But Tosfot said that it's not going to be that way, and he said that eventually it will turn differently. So again, we're not going to that direction, we're just mentioning that for you to read. So now, why we're talking about in a Mishnah, we're dealing with solitary garden bed, so that it's not enough space in the corner. So so how you will be able to do it? So Amrei Rav, Mishmei de Rav, so the school of Rav taught in the name of Rav, Bememale takranot. So in other words, he planted this field in such a way that he go all the way in each one of those 4 corners of his property. Now, those kranot, those corners, he also filled them. So, therefore, there is an issue that since you fill the corner of the flowerbird and with the 5 species of seeds, so there is no room for any variety, because you already filled all these corners. So the GEMARA asked, "Velizara me'abrai." So you know what? You come to him and you said, you know, you should plant this at the around outside and not fill the inside. Velo limalei migavei. You will not fill inside, which means Rashi explained here and you see the picture, beautiful picture that Rashi provided, he should plant in the corner, the central corner, and he will not fill it fully, and therefore it's a spot. If you look carefully, you see it's a spot in the central part in the middle that it can do something. Ritva explained it much clearer, but that's so why we need to have the Mishnah in Aruga Bechurva. We just turned the page 85b. The Gemara said, Gzera Shema Yemale et Akranot. They put, the rabbis always put a decree, a Gzera, that maybe this person's going to do it either intentionally or unintentionally, but you can say that one filled the corner after having first planted the garden bed, he go and planted, filled it up, which means he figure out, since it's so fruitful and so good, so let me fill. So there are several explanations. They said Gzera Shema Yemalet Akranot. What is exactly the Gzera? So you see here several schools of thought. There is a school of thought of Rashi, that he knows and he will not pay attention of the mixture between the two. There is a Tosfot that he said that since it's the square way, so it's like Rosh Tor, you see the head, and therefore you're not going to mix clearly. So the Tosfot main concern is Heker, that you recognize the difference. Chazon Ish have a lot to discuss with this, and the Chazon Ish main explanation is Rabbi Karelitz, may rest in peace, explain that as long as you make it clear, let's talk just for the sake of understanding, one is a yellow and one is a red and one is a green, and one is made in the triangle, and one is a round and one is a square, and you put a clear space between them, right, etc., etc. So that's a different story. But if you don't have that, the fear is that you're going to fill it up in between, intentionally or unintentionally. The Rambam in Pirusha Mishnayot, in Mishnah, he said that this, it's not really what we are now discussing, going to discuss, is not halachic dispute, but more to clarify the whole point of corners, to make it sharp and to crystallize the whole, to clarify the point of the corners, to make it so lucid so people will not mix. In other words, it's not just the distance between each of the garden bed, it's also the appearance, the color, the size, the appearance of each one of them. So now the Gemara asks, Velo yehe ela kirosh tor. So Gemara said that it should be like a triangular plot of vegetable. So Rashi here has this example of Rosh Tor. He make it upside down, but the idea is that usually when you talk about this type of garden bed, they go in a certain way that it end up triangle. That's the way they grow, especially if you planted it. Rashi here, by the way, used the word klomar, and I elaborate in my book, Biurei Klomar Berashi al Hashas, why Rashi used here the word klomar and what he meant. So basically Rashi said, I just give you the abbreviation, we don't have the time. The idea of Rosh Tor, it's a special tzura, it's a special way that you see the keren zavit, you see the corner in a very clear way. Here we don't have this type. So Rashi meant to say, when he used the word klomar, that Rosh Tor, this type of triangle, it's not necessarily, but as long as it's appearing that way, it's basically on the Rashi Bava Batra Samech Bet 62, that Rashi in Dibur HaMatchil V'Yikneh explained it, that as long as it's not necessarily the triangle looks like, but as long as they have this idea. Now again, when we're speaking about Rosh Tor, that's the Chazon Ish point of view. What do you mean by Rosh Tor? You mean by triangle, you just want to make it something different, or you want to emphasize that this should never come in contact with the others, with the neighbors. That's the key point of Rosh Tor. So we said Yarak Milotnan, when one is entered to the others, did we learn it in the Tractate Kilayim chapter 3, Im haya Rosh Tor Yarak Nichnas letoch sadeh acher mutar. So the Mishnah said that if you have the triangle, it's like a vanguard, like the top, over the time go to where? To the neighbor's garden bed. So they said it's not considering a violation of Isur Kilayim, of the law of a mixture. Why? Mipnei shenir'eh sof hasadeh. Because you see the end of the field in very clear way, which means you see where it's coming out, and you see that that one is not connected to the neighbors, and is not a mixture here. So you can compare to our discussion that if you have aruga ben arugot, if you have a garden bed among others, because as long as each one of them has a very clear sign that you recognize the difference, so what's the problem now to fill up these boundary lines? Remember, the guy tried to make a living, and he figure out, let's say, let's call them an ABC. You have 5 properties, A, B, C, D, E. E is the center part, is the round corner. And then you have A that is a triangle. And he has a B, like some of the Mefarshim, is a square. And is a different type of seeds that he plant in A, B, C, D, E. Okay? So now you have a border lines of 2 tfachim in between each of them. And a person said, look, my B is so beautiful and so fruitful, it makes so much income that it's even better than A and C together. So can I go ahead and go to the borderline, since it's very clear to me, to my employees, the difference between A and B and C, and I put these borderlines between B and C and B and A, and fill that borderline with what? With B fields. So I'll, extended my business. So what's exactly the point here? So the Chazon Ish said the key point is that the Torah is very scrupulous with the idea of mixing. Again, we're not talking about mixture of the yenika, of the ground, underground. We consider about mixture. Now, the only mixture applied to complete mixture of 2 plants that come out together. But here, what happened here? The plant B and the plant A and the plant C has nothing to do with each other, which means you planted separately. When you planted, you put the separation line. Now it's already growth. So now you ask a question, can I extended my B property over the border lines, since I don't have any mixture now between B and A or B and C? Right? And even you may say, but come on, they're using the same source of living, the same water, the same fruitful materials, but since I planted them separately, can I extend it B? That's the question. So the GEMARA responded and said, Ein Rosh Tor Ba'aruga. The GEMARA said, wait a second, there is no leniency with regard to a triangular plot in a garden bed. Which means, because you cannot consider each of them as separate entities, so this idea of the triangular, it's a very nice and it's clear, okay, but if you don't put the 3 hand cube between them, they still reduce the clarity of the distance between them. Ushmuel Amar, and Shmuel said, when we learn that we learn early in the Mishnah that one they put this type of 5 different species in the land, it's a pick about what? Aruga ben arugot, a garden bed among garden beds, not only solitary bed, which means that now the Gemara tried to tell us that Shmuel allowed to fill this part of each of them with a plan, excluding the corners, which means Shmuel said you can go to the whole part of the field and fill up spot in between and fill up the spot all over, as long as you not touch the Rosh HaTor, the top corner. So the Gemara asks a question, come on, why Shmuel said that? Guess what happening? If you're planting the seed, so don't the seed become intermingle with one another, right? Because what happened? This leaf will mix between them. Why? Because it's only shnei tfachim, it's only 2 handbreadth of the borderline. So Rashi here elaborates beautifully, and he said, even you tell me that according to Shmuel, each one of the garden bed is clearly a display that you recognize as different, but still it's a mixture. You see that they are mixing in between, and therefore you enter the domain of Kilayim. So the Gemara responded and said, "Benoteh shura lechan veshura lechan." You know what he does? He inclines one row to here, the Meiri said, which is in one direction, and the row here he put in a different direction. So since they are not mixing in between, so Rashi said, so Shmuel meant as long you can plant in between the garden bed, only if it's in a distance between them. It's because you remember what we said earlier. We said here like Gzeira, it's a decree, Shema yemale et hakranot, that the person see that he's making money and he gets hungry and greedy. So what did he try to do now? He tried to fill up the spot between the properties. So he said, excuse me, Amar Ula. Ula is the Gemara said in Ketubot, if you remember when we studied Ketubot, that Ula was a person that he always traveled from Eretz Israel to Babylon. He went, he bring questions, etc. It was a permanent traveler, great sage. So they said, Amar Ula, Ba'u b'ma'arava, this quandary, this dilemma they raise in the west, that the west of Babylon is Eretz Israel. Ifki'a telem echad al pnei kulam ma'u. If a person dig, the Tosfot said, the Gaonim said, it's a one dug a furrow between 2 garden beds. Why someone does that? So let's talk a little bit agricultural. Chazon Ish is one of the exceptional sages that explain it. What happened when you want to improve your field? Anyone here has something around your house and you're planting something, can be tomatoes, cucumbers, things like that. You know that sometimes what you have to do, you have to turn around, dug a furrow around it, either around, or you change the earth, or you do all kind of improvement in the field in order to improve it, to bring a better vegetable or better fruits or whatever you plant. Now guess what? He just dug a furrow, and then what did he do? In that spot that he dug, he planted a new seed. So since that spot, it's not in distance of 3 handbreadth to the one it's already planted, let's say, a couple of months ago or last year, is that okay or not? So now you see a serious dispute. Amar Rav Sheshet, Rav Sheshet said, Ba irbuv ubitel et hashura. Wait a second. You have a boarding line, and the boarding line said that you have to have a certain distance between them. Now, by doing this, you're digging this furrow, you're mixing everything, and it's a problem. Rav Asi Amar, or Rav Ashi, he said, Ein eruvo mevatel et hashura. He said, Rav Ashi said that this intermingling does not disqualify the row. You see the problem? because now it's a new plant. What's the real issue? Let's think together. So the Chazon Ish tells us that the shi'ur yanika, that when you're planting this seed in underground, they did not allow the fifth, min chamishi, the fifth one, to be there, only if it's a separate. Why? Because nir'ah kirbuv, it looks like it's mixture. So here of us he hold that this is not an issue. Why? Because remember, you planted original, let's use example. You planted tomato last year, now you dug a furrow in that, around that area, and you planted something else, and now it's a different time, it's a different plants, a different things. It's not mixture of two together. Eitivei Ravina le Ravashi. Ravina now attacking, and he raises a certain objection to what Ravashi just said. Hanotea shtei shurot. If one plants two rows, for example, shel kishuim, shtei shurot shel diluim, shtei shurot shel pol hamitzri. Here, take for example, one plants two rows of cucumbers, two rows of grounds, and two rows of Egyptian beans. So now, it's not an issue, even he's not distanced between them properly. He said, mutar, it's permitted, because each of this one of the species is separated. On the contrary, he said, shura achat shel kishuim, v'shura achat shel diluim, v'shura achat shel pol hamitzri, asur. But if one plants one rows of cucumbers, and one rows of grounds, and one rows of Egyptian beans, that's a problem. Why it's a problem? Because you do not have in one line a very clear line, a very clear way to see that there is a difference between the species. So what we learn from that one telem, one dagging for, it's not sufficient to make it heker, to make it clear, to make the difference between the species of the seeds and to recognize the distance between them, because it's three different species. So they said shane hacha the ika sharcha. He was different because what? Because they have the branches that grow out from these species which become interangles with each other, which means that this kishuin, dluin, pol hamitzri, each one of them, it's long line, and at the top they can mix in several places. So again, you remember the key point is heker. Heker meaning if you recognize. Here you have an issue when you make a long line that at the top of those growth vegetations you do not recognize. If you come, for example, with helicopter, you do not recognize the difference between the three. However, in regard to other species, so it's not that issue. So that's the reason why Rav Asi said that the telem is not annul this type of garden bed. Amar Rav Kahana. Now Rav Kahana come with a beautiful resolution, and he said, and that's the conclusion of our study of today. Rav Kahana said, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, harotze lemalot kol ginato. If someone wants to fill the entire garden with vegetables, what he should do? Yarak, he wants to make it all vegetables. עושה ערוגה שישה על שישה ועוגל בה חמישה וממלא קרנותיה בכל מה שירצה. So he wants to make a space, and you to make it clear between each of them. So he make a garden bed, that's the Rambam said and the Geonim said. He make the garden bed 6 by 6 handbreadths and make 5 circles inside it. So what happened is, now it's very clear. Now you see the distance, and you can fill up whatever, any species you want in between. So they said, now remember, look at the Tosfot here, he elaborates beautifully, but again, we're running out of time. So the GEMARA asks, Ve'ika de beine o veine, but in between those circles, you have these border lines that you cannot plant it. You remember we talked that there has to be a space. So if you're planting there, what's happening is those already getting attached to each other. and it will be a mixture of two species. So how do you say it? So Chazon Ish said here, he elaborated on this Rashi beautifully, and he said, if you planted in out those borderlines of that plant, it will be mixture. But if you know clearly that you recognize and you see the difference between them very clearly, so how Rabbi Yochanan said here that you can fill all this area with different vegetables. So he said, Amre dever Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Yanai said, B'machariv ben habenaim. That what did he do? He have some spot. There is a space between them, the barren, and does not plant there. So Rabbi Yochanan doesn't mean that you allow to fill all the garden, but you can fill the area excluding what? The borderline. That's one explanation. The next one, Rav Ashi Amar, Im ayu zru'in sheti, zor'an erev. Erev, zor'an sheti. Which means that, you know, there is a Torah prohibition of mixing shti and erev. So if he said, if he plants seed between widthwise, and if he circle where the plant widthwise, he plant the seed between lengthwise, and vice versa. Eitivei Ravina le Ravashi. So now they ask on Rabbi Yochanan's point, Avodat yarak beyarak acher shisha tfachim, vero'in otam, if you have vegetables or different species, and you have 6 handbread, and one views them, how he views them, ketavla merubat, which means that it's like a square board, ketavla udeshare halavache asu. So you allow, so it's permitted to make it like a square board, but it's otherwise it's prohibited because it's not considering a garden bed. So the conclusion is hatam laakule bekula harina latiroshto yotze mimena. So over there it's permitted because a triangle plot protrudes from it in another field, which means again it looks different when you have this triangle and you recognize the difference between them. So the brighter doesn't mean that you're allowed to make it in 5 different species. It means that again, since you make it in a certain way, for example, this one is a square, this one is a round, this was a triangle, as we said earlier, so that's okay. Let's go to several halakhot. Today we talk agriculture and farming, and this is a Rambam, Hilchot Kilayim, the halakhot of mixture. Aruga bechurba, a single garden bed with 5 different species may be planted in a barren area, isolated from other gardens. However, if it is among other beds, there must be a clear demarcation of each type of plant. So that's the ruling of Rav, and the halacha is ruled according to the opinion of him in these ritual manners. Now we talk also about the rationale behind that. Why we have to have this borderline and space. Gzeira shema yemale takranot. The Rambam said, he explained, it's a decree lest one will fill the corners, because it is prohibited to sow outside of a garden bed without a separation of a furrow, even a adjustment into an empty corner where nothing is planted. That's what they concern, that one may sow 4 different species in 4 different corners of the garden bed, and these species will intermingle with the species outside of the 4 corners, and then you enter the domain of a problem. Now we said another resolution, we said benotesh shura lechan veshura lechan. So if a garden bed is situated among other beds and one seeks to plant 5 species, in each one he must incline the leaves in one bed to one side and the leaf on the other bed to other side. But Rav disagreed with Shmuel with regard to the explanation of this Mishnah, not with regard to halacha. If one dug a furrow between 2 garden beds, he is permitted to fill each bed. So that's basically the Rav Ashi, because Rav Ashi is the authority. The last halacha, הרוצה למלות כל גינתו ירק. You say that one who wishes to fill his entire garden with various vegetables without distancing them from one another. So what he should do? He can make a square-shaped beds of at least 6 by 6 handbreadths, draw 5 circles and plant different species in each circle, and one may plant an additional species in the corners. And in general, if one wants to fill the entire space, he may plant the circles in horizontal rows and fill the space in between them with vertical rows of different plants. So again, as long as you have siman eker, the Rambam said, so it's fine. You make those siman. And again, I encourage you to see this, all this opinion, how it goes between the Rambam and Geonim and the Raavad. The key point is siman eker. As long as you recognize, you overcome the very big obstacle.
Es Hashem